we start calling such type of interaction as the competition interaction, right? And the fifth one, what we saw was, if one species is being benefited and the other species is neither benefited nor harmed, right? So one species, if it is benefited and the other species is neither benefited nor harmed, such type of interaction we would start calling it as commensalism. And the last one what we took up is with regards to something called as amensalism, where I told you that one species is being harmed while the other one is neither benefited nor harmed because of that interaction. Such sort of interaction we started calling it as amensalism. So we have commensalism as well as amensalism. So those are the 6 different species interactions what we have. Interactions between 2 different groups of organisms or 2 different species. So today, let us begin with the first type of interaction what we have in the list, which is called as mutualism, right? So let us take up with the population interaction. So we are taking up, the title is said to be population interactions. And under population interactions, the first type of interaction what we'll be taking up is called as mutualism. Right. So in mutualism, what happens in this type of interaction? That is mutualistic interaction. So what happens here in mutualism is, as we have already discussed, there are 2 groups of organisms, 2 different species, of which both the species are being benefited through that sort of interaction. So if any interaction or if any relationship, if both the species are being benefited mutually, we would start calling such type of interaction as mutualistic interaction. So let us take a few examples in understanding this mutualistic interaction. So the first example what we'll be taking up, is with regards to something called as lichens. Right? I hope all of you are familiar with lichens, right? So lichens are a group of, it is one sort of mutualistic interaction again between 2 different species of organisms, in which first species is called the algae and the other one is called the fungi. So the mutualistic interaction between 2 different species, the algae and fungi, we start calling it as lichens, and lichens is one of the mutualistic relationships in here. Now, in this sort of relationship or this sort of interaction, both of these organisms are said to be mutually benefited, right, through this sort of interaction. So how are they benefited? What does the algae do? The algae, it prepares food for the lichens and itself, right? So algae prepares food, and that food which is being prepared by algae will be given to the fungi, because we know that fungi cannot prepare their own food. Why fungi cannot prepare their own food? Because they are simply saprophytes. Since fungi are saprophytes, they do not prepare their own food, so they usually rely on the other organism for their food purposes. So here their food purpose is being solved due to its interaction with algae. So algae prepares the food and gives the food to fungi. In turn, what is fungi doing to the algae? Fungi will start absorbing water and it would start giving water to algae, and also it gives protection to the algae, right? So in turn, what fungi is doing is it starts absorbing the water and it would give the water to algae, and at the same time it starts giving protection to the algae. So what algae does again? Algae prepares food and gives it to the fungi. In turn, algae will start enjoying the benefits of protection as well as water from the fungi. So this sort of relationship where both the interacting organisms are being benefited, such type of interaction we would start calling it as the mutualistic interaction. Right. Now this type of interaction we also call it as symbiotic interaction, or we also call it as symbiosis. Right. So what do we mean by symbiosis? Symbiosis is nothing but permanent interaction between the 2 interacting species, right? So these 2 are said to be permanently interacting with each other. If algae and fungi are separated, these organisms would not be able to survive. So that sort of interaction we start calling it as symbiosis. So symbiosis is a type of mutualistic interaction which is shown by organisms, where both the organisms are said to be permanently dependent on each other for their survival. So if this is the case, if both the interacting species are being benefited, if that is the case, we would start calling such type of interaction as mutualism. The first example what we can take. The second example what we can take for mutualism is with regards to mycorrhiza. Right? Mycorrhiza or mycorrhizae. So I hope this also you would have studied about mycorrhiza or mycorrhizae. So mycorrhiza is association between two different organisms again. One is the fungi, and the second interacting species here is the roots of higher plants. Roots of higher plants. So these are the two interacting species here, fungi as well as the roots of the higher plants. So again, both of them, they are said to undergo mutualistic relationship. How exactly mutualistic relationship? What is the fungi doing to the higher plants? Fungi, what it does is it starts absorbing minerals, right? It would start absorbing minerals, especially phosphorus, right? Especially phosphorus, and it would give it to the plants, right? So what fungi does in this sort of interaction, it would absorb the minerals from the soil, and those minerals, especially phosphorus, it would pass it on to the plants. In turn, what are the plants actually doing here? Right? In turn, what are the plants actually doing here? The plants would start preparing food, right? The plants would prepare the food and it would give the food to the fungi, right? So plants would prepare the food and that food would again be given to the fungi. So again, there is a mutualistic interaction taking place, and also the higher this roots would also provide space for the growth of this fungi, right? So what is fungi doing? Fungi will start absorbing the minerals from the soil, especially phosphorus, and it would give those minerals to the roots of the higher plants. In turn, what is the plant doing? The plant prepares the food and gives the food to the fungi, and also it would start providing space for the growth of the fungi. So that's how these two species would start interacting. Again, the type of mutualism here is again said to be symbiosis. So they also undergo symbiotic association because these two interaction between these two organisms is also said to be permanent interaction. So if fungi is removed from this sort of interaction, which we call it as mycorrhiza, say suppose if fungi is removed from it, the plant will not get enough of phosphorus for their proper growth. As a result of which, the plant would remain stunted, right? So this growth of this plant would be stunted because of deficiency of phosphorus. Because plants are not able to absorb phosphorus, they require fungi for the mineral called as phosphorus. So if fungi is being removed from this association from mycorrhiza, the plant will not be able to grow in a normal manner. So the growth of this plant would be stunted. Similarly, if fungi has been separated, fungi alone cannot survive because they cannot prepare their own food. They require other organisms for their food purposes. Right? So this type of interaction again, where both these organisms are being benefited, we start calling it as mutualistic interaction. Again, just like symbiosis in case of lichens, even in case of mycorrhiza also, the mutualistic relationship is said to be symbiotic relationship, where the interaction between the two species is said to be a permanent interaction. Right. So this is what we have, the two examples pertaining to the process called as, or the interaction called as mutualism. Let us take a couple of examples more to study about this mutualism. The third example, what we'll be taking up is a temporary interaction. A temporary interaction between the two species. So till now, what we have seen in these two cases is a permanent interaction. The third example, what we'll be taking up is a temporary interaction. This sort of interaction is usually seen between the pollinator species, as well as the plants, right? The type of interaction between the pollinator species as well as the plant. So in most of the cases, the pollinator species are nothing but insects, right? So the type of interaction that is seen between the insects and the plant. So this again, we start calling it as a mutualistic interaction. So why again mutualistic interaction here? What is the insects actually doing? Insects are actually helping the plant in bringing about the process called as pollination, the cross-pollination. We know that, right? Cross-pollination is mostly favored by insects, right? So insects would come onto the plants, sit on the flower, and they start pollinating the plant species. In turn, what is the plants doing to the insects? Plants will start providing food that is required for this particular insect in the form of nectar, right? So the insects would come and sit on the flower and they would start collecting the nectar for their food. In turn, what are the insects doing? They are carrying the pollen grains and they are dispersing it far off, thereby favoring the process of cross-pollination. Here again, both of these organisms are said to be benefited. The insects are benefited. So how are the insects being benefited? They are able to get the food sources. Their food sources is being, their food problem is being solved. How? The plant would provide the nectar. In turn, in return to that, what are the insects doing? They are favoring the process of cross-pollination. Right? So this is another type of mutualistic interaction we have, where the interaction between these two species is said to be a temporary interaction and not a permanent interaction. Right? Like in case of lichens and mycorrhiza, we said that it is a permanent interaction. Organisms cannot live if they are separated. But here it is said to be a temporary interaction between these two organisms. Whenever the insects require food, it would come and sit on the plant, get their nectar. In turn, while leaving, it would pick up the pollen grains and favor the process of cross-pollination. This is what is happening. Sometimes what happens is, in this sort of interaction, just telling you, sometimes what happens is, only the plants will be benefited while the insects may not be benefited. Right? In certain condition, there is one condition, peculiar condition. I'll just tell you that. Right? So what happens in this condition is only the plant will be benefited, while the insect will not be benefited. So this sort of a condition is usually seen in an orchid plant, which is called as Ophrys. Ophrys, 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 which is an orchid, right? Living orchid, which is actually growing in the Mediterranean region. Right. So this orchid Ophrys, what it does is it would start attracting the pollinator insect, which is actually the bees. Right. So bees are actually considered as the pollinator species for this particular plant, the Ophrys, which is growing in the Mediterranean region. So what this Ophrys does is, it starts modifying its flower. Right. It would start modifying its flower in such a way that the entire flower would exactly resemble the female bee. It would exactly resemble the female, right? So what exactly is the flower of the Ophrys doing? The petals of the flower, right, of the plant Ophrys, the orchid, it gets modified in such a way that it would exactly resemble, right? It would exactly resemble the female bee. Right. Since it resembles the female bee, now the male bee will start thinking that the female bee is there. So it would go to that female bee and start undergoing the process of copulation, thinking that it is a female. But actually speaking, it is not the bee. It is just the petals of the flower which has been modified in the form of a female. So this type of copulation is usually referred to as the pseudo-copulation. Right? It is referred to as pseudo-copulation, which is shown by, or the interaction is shown between Ophrys as well as bees, where the Ophrys, the flower of the Ophrys will be modified in such a way that it resembles exactly to that of the female bee. And the male bee will think that it is female bee and it will start undergoing the process of copulation, thinking that it is a female bee, but actually speaking, it is the flower of the orchid plant. So this type of process we start calling as pseudo-copulation. Pseudo is false copulation. Right. So during this time, what happens? This particular male bee will start picking up the pollen grains from this particular orchid, and it would start favoring the cross-pollination. Right. So what exactly is doing here? The plant is getting benefited, but here the animal is not getting benefited. Why it is not getting benefited? Because there is no female there. It is only the flower which resembles the female orchid. Right? So here we start calling that process as pseudo-copulation, which is shown between interaction between the Ophrys and orchid as well as the bees, which act as a pollinator species. So this is again one more example what we can take from mutualism. Again, remember, this type of interaction is said to be a temporary interaction and not a permanent interaction. Right? So this is what we have with the third type of interaction. The fourth example what we can take is the interactions between fig, right? The interaction between fig as well as another organisms which are called as wasps, right? The figs as well as wasps, right? So fig, I hope all of you are familiar with fig trees and fig plants, right? Wasps are nothing but small insects. So these two are again the interacting species here. Again, remember, the type of interaction here is said to be a temporary interaction. Again, the same thing happens, right? So fig, right? How is fig being benefited? For the process of pollination. So when the wasps come into the fig, right? The fig, it starts carrying the pollen grains from the fig tree and it starts undergoing the process of cross-pollination. Now, how are the wasps being benefited here? Wasps would usually lay their eggs in the inflorescence of the fig tree, right? It would lay their eggs in the inflorescence. right? As a result of which, once the eggs hatch and the larva comes out of it, the seeds that are present in the inflorescence is taken up by these growing larvae for their complete development. So that's how the wasps are being benefited, right? So the wasps are benefited in such a way that they would lay their eggs in the inflorescence. As and when the eggs would hatch and the organisms or the larvae would be formed, that larvae would now start feeding on the larvae would start feeding on the seeds of the fig plant, as a result of which they are able to undergo the process of development. So that's how wasps are being benefited. And figs, again, they start favoring the process of cross-pollination. As and when the wasps lay their eggs and are moving out of the inflorescence, they would start picking up or collecting the pollen grains, and they would start favoring the process of cross-pollination. Right. So this is again another temporary interaction between these two organisms, which again falls under the category of mutualism, where both the interacting species are being benefited. So in any sort of interaction, if both the species are being mutually benefited, such type of interaction we would start calling it as mutualistic interaction, or we would start calling it as mutualism. Right? So this is the first type of interaction what we have, where both the interacting species are being benefited. Right? So let's now move on into the next type of interaction, the second type of interaction. So the second type of interaction what we'll be taking up is called as parasitism. Right? So let us take up with parasitism. So what's happening in parasitism? So in case of mutualism, what did we say? Both the species are being benefited. So we indicated by plus sign and plus sign. So species A and species B, both are being benefited. Right. Let us take up with the second interaction now, which is called as parasitism. So what happens in parasitism? In parasitism, we said that one species would be benefited while the other species would be harmed. Right? So one of the interacting species is being benefited while the other species, other interacting species is being harmed. If this is the condition, we would start calling it as parasitism. Right? So two species, one is being benefited and the other one is being harmed. Right. Now let's get into some details with regards to this interaction called as parasitism. So we have said that one is being benefited and the other one is being harmed. So the benefited species, right? So the benefited species is called as a parasite, whereas the harmed species is called as prey. Right? So the benefited species is called as the parasite, and the harmed species is called as not the prey, it is called the host. Right? The benefited species is called parasite, and the harmed species is called as the host. Right? Now, when we talk about this parasite, what exactly is happening is these parasites, they are said to be completely dependent on the host organism, majorly for the nutrition. They are completely dependent on the host organism, majorly for nutrition. So whatever nutrition is available in the host organism, that would be absorbed by this parasite, as a result of which the host will not have enough of nutrition for their survival, as a result of which the host organism is being harmed. Sometimes if the number of species of the parasite increases within the host organism, it can even lead to the death of the host organism as well. Right? So this is what we have with the parasitism of the parasite as well as the host species. Right? So the organism which is being benefited is called the parasite, and the one which is being harmed, we call it as host. Now, whenever we talk about parasite, we usually talk about two different types of parasites. Right? There are two different types of parasites. One is called as endoparasite. Right? One we call it as endoparasite. I write it down here itself. So one is called endoparasite, and the other one is called as ectoparasite. So we have two types of parasites, endoparasite and ectoparasite. Now what does this mean, endoparasite? Endo refers to inside. Parasite, the organism which is dependent on the host organism. So this endoparasite usually lives inside the body of the host organism. They usually live inside the body of the host organism. Whereas ectoparasite, ecto refers to outside. So these parasites usually live outside the body of the host organism. So if any parasite lives inside the body of the host organism, we would start calling it as endoparasite. parasite which is living outside the body of the host organism, we would start calling it as ectoparasite. Now, what examples can we take for endoparasite? So, some examples what we can take is the tapeworm, right? So, tapeworm can be taken as an example for endoparasite. Then we have another word which is called liver fluke. All roundworms, majority of the roundworms we have liver fluke. Then we can take the example of malarial parasite, Plasmodium. So all these are said to be endoparasite, which lives inside the body of the host organism. Now, some of these organisms have more than one host also. If you see in case of tapeworm has two hosts, right? One is man and the other one is pig, right? So tapeworm has two hosts. One is man, other one is pig. Similarly, liver fluke also has two hosts. One is man and the other one is dog. Malaria parasite also has two hosts, right? What are the two hosts? One is man and the other one is female Anopheles mosquito, right? So each of these organisms, they have two, but there are certain organisms, certain endoparasites which have one single host also. Like we can take the example of Ascaris, right? In case of Ascaris, there is only one single host and that host is nothing but the humans, man. Right. So it depends, right? If a particular parasite is able to complete its life cycle within one host, it has only one host. If they require more than one, they have more than one host, as seen in case of all of these organisms. So some examples what we can take for ectoparasite. Ectoparasite, we can take the example of leech. The blood-sucking leech can be taken as an example for ectoparasite, right? Along with that, we can take the example of ticks. We can take the example of lice. So all these are some of the organisms which live outside the body of the host organism, right? So endoparasites, they live inside the body of the host organism. Ectoparasites, they live outside the body of the host organism. Now, talking about this endoparasite, since a particular parasite or this endoparasite lives inside the body of the host organism, they usually undergo some sort of they usually undergo some sort of adaptations, which we start calling it as parasitic adaptations. Only because of these parasitic adaptations, these organisms, that is endoparasites, they are able to survive or live inside the body of the host organism. So let us quickly see what are some of those adaptations which are shown by these endoparasites, right? So adaptations shown by endoparasites. So what are the adaptations? The first and foremost adaptation which is shown by them is they have a thick cuticle. They have a thick cuticle. So cuticle is nothing but the outermost layer of the body of this organism. So these organisms, they have a thick cuticle. Why do they have a thick cuticle? Because if you see the tapeworm usually lives in a digestive tract, mostly the intestine. So if this organism is living in the intestine, our intestine has several digestive enzymes being released during the process of digestion. So if this organism has to survive in the intestine, it has to be resistant to all the digestive juices which are being secreted by the intestine. So to prevent that, they would have a thick outer layer of the body, which we call it as thick cuticle. So these organisms usually have a thick cuticle, one of the most important parasitic adaptations shown by all the endoparasites. Right. Second one, these organisms are provided with structures called as hooks. Right, they are provided with hooks, right? So what are these hooks responsible for? Hooks act as a hold fast organ. We also call them as hold fast organs. So what do we mean by these hold fast organs? Organs which are helpful for the organism to stick on to that particular place, right? So they would start acting like a hook. So with the help of hook, they would hold on to that particular organism, as a result of which it is able to stay in that particular place. So they have hooks, so that they are able to hold on to that particular place where they are actually surviving. Along with hooks, these also have something called as suckers, right? So since these organisms usually absorb the digested food from the host organism, they require certain structures called as suckers, because of through which